Hello friends! Has your spouse recently filed for divorce and had that paperwork served on you? You heard that knock at the front door and it was a police officer or a private investigator serving you with the divorce papers. And now, as you sit there in the dark reading those paperwork, you think to yourself, how am I going to get this person back? Well, don't do it. There's probably a status quo or standing order filed in your case. And today, we're going to talk about the most common ways people violate either status quo or standing orders. Welcome back to the Divorce Broadcast. My name is Manny Segarra, coming to you from Miami, Florida. Alright, so we did a whole video a couple months back on what status quo or standing orders are. We invite you to check that video out again. Just a brief explanation of what these orders are. They are usually filed in the beginning of a case when a person files for divorce. Status quo, when it comes to divorce cases, essentially means the current state of affairs, or when it comes to the parties, the current existing financial circumstances of the parties. When it comes to the children, it means the current situation with regard to where the children are in school, or who's making decisions about the children, or what the current time sharing or visitation schedule is. This includes customary payments, customary expenses, and stuff like that. So we will talk and give examples of what these different status quo principles or areas are, so that we can then talk about how people usually violate them. Always remember that status quo orders and standing orders are always different in the different jurisdictions, usually by county, state by state. So make sure that whoever's involved in a divorce proceeding checks out their particular status quo or standing order requirements. When it comes to status quo and standing orders as they relate to children, a lot of the jurisdictions are pretty consistent in that there are several guidelines or rules of thumb. Initially, there is usually a restriction on either party's ability to relocate with the children either out of the county in which the children reside or out of the state where they reside. Also, there is often a prohibition as to seeking a passport for the children while the case is initially pending. As it relates to shared parental responsibility, there's often a requirement that the parties confer and make all decisions relating to the children jointly, whether it be educational, medical, or religious. Also, the parent who does not have the children the majority of the time is usually encouraged to make voluntary child support payments. One of the best examples of when someone violates a status quo or standing order as it relates to children is when they unilaterally take them out of a school or unilaterally move them out of the state while the case is initially pending. That is a big no-no because oftentimes judges get really upset, so be on the lookout for that. Furthermore, as it relates to marital assets, the status quo or standing orders usually have language that tries to protect each party's interest in marital assets and liabilities. Oftentimes, these status quo or standing orders prohibit the concealment, damage, or dissipation of marital assets. They don't allow the parties to either hide, hoard, or waste joint bank accounts. The best example of dissipation of assets in a divorce proceeding is often when one of the parties is having an extramarital affair. That's right. Unfortunately, this happens in some cases. What ends up happening is that one of the parties now has a new relationship, and during the course of that new relationship, they take their new paramour either out to dinner, on vacation, or they spend a lot of money either on their clothing or maybe even paying for their own bills or the bills of that paramour. This is a classic example of violating a status quo or standing order payment by dissipating either assets or joint marital funds. Now, when it comes to household expenses, these status quo or standing orders usually obligate the parties to continue to pay their household expenses as they always and customarily did. Some examples of the common household expenses are the mortgage and the rent. Also, we may consider the homeowner's insurance and the property taxes. As it relates to utilities, we're talking about electricity, water, telephone, telephone, cable, internet service. Also, lawn care and the pool care. Those are great examples of common household expenses. Even if it comes to a housekeeper or cleaning service, that could be considered a normal household expense. One of the classic bad examples, in other words, this is an example of how people violate the status quo payment, is when they stop paying the utilities and their spouse is sitting there and all of a sudden all the lights go out. That's not cool, because that spouse is then going to have to file an emergency motion, and if a judge finds out that the electricity was cut either on purpose or because the other spouse was upset, they're going to have a problem in court. Another example of a status quo or standing order ongoing payment often relates to automobile expenses. That's right, the finance or lease payments must continue to keep current. Any expenses for gasoline, if one of the parties has to travel for work and has to pay tolls and gas and parking, tags and registration, that must remain current, and any type of automobile insurance. One of the classic examples of someone violating a status quo or standing order as it relates to automobile expenses is if they fail to make the finance or the lease payments for the other spouse that they had done so routinely during the course of the marriage, and next thing you know, that spouse is about to walk out the door and they see the tow truck approach and their car get towed away out their driveway in the front yard because it got repossessed. Bad move. Now let's talk about the children's expenses. That's right, there are children's expenses that continue to need to be paid pursuant to the status quo or standing orders, starting with daycare. If there is a special tutor or enrichment classes because the child is behind in school. If there's therapy, let's say the child has special needs and there's either occupational, speech, or other types of therapy, those must continue to be paid. If there's a summer camp that the child attends, that must be continued to be paid. A great example of someone violating a status quo or standing order payment, let's say the parties traditionally had enrolled the minor child in private school, and then one of the parents, without a court order, unilaterally decides that they're going to stop making that private school payment. Well, when that child shows up to school, they're going to be escorted either to the principal's office or the financial aid office, and they're going to be told that they can no longer attend. That is going to look really bad, not only to the court, but the child is going to be traumatized as well. So don't do that. Besides this, there are also the insurance payments. That's right, a lot of people take insurance payments for granted, but we're talking about all types of insurance. This includes health insurance, life insurance, disability insurance. A great example of someone violating either the status quo or standing order as it relates to insurance is that they fail to pay for the other spouse's health insurance. They let it expire, or they don't pay the premium, or somehow when the renewal comes they forget to add their spouse. That is not a good move, especially if, God forbid, the spouse gets sick and needs like an emergency surgery. They show up to the hospital and the hospital says, we're not going to give you any type of service. You'll have to go to a different hospital that accepts people without insurance because your insurance premium was not paid. That does not look good. And if that spouse files an emergency motion and then the spouse who forgot to pay or purposely didn't pay the insurance shows up in front of the judge, they're going to get a very serious talking to. And some of the final expenses that are the normal or customary expenses include some of the following. The fur babies, that's right, pet expenses. You can't just stop paying for the specialized food for your pet. Some of the pets, they have specialized food. I have 2 pets at home, one of which was on the channel, as all of you know, and they both have allergies and sensitive stomachs. So you have to pay a couple $100 a month just to get their food right. And if that doesn't happen because one of the spouses cuts them off, that could look really bad. Student loan payments is another miscellaneous expense, as are payments to all the credit cards and creditors. These type of expenses, if they are customary during the course of the marriage, are something that need to be paid on a consistent basis. We'd also like to hear maybe examples from all of you in the comment section as to what other miscellaneous expenses may be as it comes to status quo and standing order payments. So what happens if one of the spouses decides that they're not going to continue to make these customary payments during the course of the divorce? Remember in the beginning of the video, we talked about how the spouse got served with divorce paperwork and now was contemplating the demise of the other spouse. Well, the spouse who the payments are no longer being made, let's use an example of the car payments are not made and the spouse is about to get their car repossessed because those payments aren't made. They can file a motion for either contempt or enforcement of the status quo order. This happens a lot of times in cases. Essentially, that spouse files a motion asking the judge to force that that other spouse to continue to make these payments. It is unfortunate when this happens because there are a lot of different effects, including the judge getting pissed off. Also, there are attorney's fees that are expended, and the spouse that is not complying may get sanctioned. Now, on the other side, what if the person who is making these status quo or standing order payments can no longer afford to make these payments? Well, they should definitely not just stop, unilaterally decide on their own, I don't want to make these payments, they annoy me, I don't like my soon-to-be ex-spouse, I'm going to get them back, I'm going to stop making these payments. Don't do that. What should happen instead is that person should consider filing a motion to either modify or abate these status quo payments. In other words, they will file a motion asking the judge, Your Honor, I can no longer afford to make that $5,000 a month mortgage payment, or I can no longer afford to pay for my spouse's car, or I can no longer afford to pay for the minor child's private schooling. The motion must be filed, there must be a hearing in front of the court, and at that point the judge will decide what to do. As a consequence of this, maybe some of the payments will be either stopped or reduced, or the court could also consider possibly liquidating some of the assets in order to make those payments. So a lot of things can happen, but we just made sure to cover both what happens if the person doesn't pay and if the person who is paying can no longer afford to pay. All right, so that is a wrap on the most common way that people violate those status quo or standing court orders. In other words, those orders that require you to continue to pay everything that you paid, especially for the expenses that have to do with the household and the children. The court's going to make you continue to pay those until there's a court order that says otherwise. If you know anyone that may find this information useful, have them look us up at www.segarralawfirm.com. We have offices in Miami and Orlando, Florida. Se habla español. Do us a favor and like this video, subscribe to the Divorce Broadcast, and give us some comments and feedback on what other status quo payments you may be thinking about that are necessary that we didn't mention on today's video. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you.